I would like to welcome you all to this first end of summer / back to business webinar put on by CERBA in coordination with our good friends and office sponsors, Schneider Group. Most people on this call will know, but perhaps you don't, that CERBA and Schneider Group are co-officed. We have been sharing office space with the group for, has it been 2 years now, Alex, or perhaps 3? We were very grateful for their sponsorship in this regard, and we have a very close and I would say mutually beneficial partnership as a result. Well, today's topic is certainly one of importance to members of our association because it deals directly with Canada. As most people on this call will know, we've just had an election in Canada, and after the most expensive election in Canadian history, it's notable that nothing has changed. We have more or less the same parliament that we had when we started. We have a liberal minority government that will probably be doing some deal making with the NDP in order to govern. But be that as it may, we have a government. So we are good for the next 5 years or something like that. In any case, the question at hand today is not Canadian politics, but rather Canadian business opportunities, specifically Canadian business opportunities in Russia. And Schneider Group is privileged to have at least 3 experts on that subject who will be speaking today. My good friend, Bob Courtney, who I'm going to turn it over to in a second, Christopher Schagerl, and Christopher Spank. So I don't have bios for the speakers. I hope that they will introduce themselves in turn as it comes their turn to speak. But I will not lead the discussion. I will leave that to the able hands of my friend, Bob Courtney. So Bob, could you please take it over from here?
Nathan, with pleasure. Good to be with you all. I'm the Schneider Group Director for North America, talking to you today from Florida, notwithstanding my Moscow River and Kremlin virtual background, but I will be there.
Florida is the southernmost province of Canada. I won't interrupt again, but that's important to know.
Well, if you look around and listen, you can hear a lot of folks saying a boat. So it's true. In any case, I'll be in the motherland on Monday and look forward to being with some of you all. So I'm going to kick us off as your moderator today. And our topic, as everyone knows, is business opportunities in Russia for Canadian clean tech and energy companies. And the substance will be presented by Christopher and Christoph. Christopher is a director of the firm based in Moscow and is the point of contact for most commercial questions. Christoph is the head of market research and is the contact point for a lot of market entry, market representative engagements and functions. Together, they'll address first the current state of the Russian economy, and then Christoph will take us specifically through the clean tech and energy and state of those opportunities. And we will come back to each other about 10 minutes before the hour for Q&A. If you'll submit any questions to the chat, I'll address them to the speakers as we go along. Gentlemen, over to Christopher.
Thank you, Robert, for the kind introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I think everything is correct today from Moscow. We will speak a little bit today about the state of the Russian economy during the pandemic times, hopefully ending the pandemic times, but also we have something similar with Canada. We also had elections on the weekends. We had 3 days elections of the Duma. We even knew the result already before because it was quite expected how it will end, and it was ended as it was expected actually, which is for usually a political issue, but for the economy quite important because the stability for the economy, to know it that the next few years nothing will happen dramatically, is also quite a good thing, I would say. But let's not speak about the politics too much. Let's speak a little more about the economical fact, what is happening now in Russia. Well, actually, for the beginning, also a quite brief overview. Yes, Russia is big. This everybody of us know. We know that also Canada is big, but Russia is actually twice of the size of Canada. The changes in the landmass, okay, with Crimea, we would not have taken it into account because this is another question which is, well, not part of the economical discussion now. From the GDP point of view, Russia and Canada are quite close to each other. While Canada is ranked 9th in the world, Russia is 11th. but having a population which is 4 times larger. What is maybe quite different is the age structure of the population. As in Russia, the people are quite young, and only 15% are in the age of 65 and elder, and about 20% are younger than 15, so which is also quite a good sign for the future. Nevertheless, having a smaller population and a higher overall GDP results in that the GDP per capita is about 4 times higher in Canada. This is something the government in Russia needs to take care for the future, as over the last years, the disposable income of the people in Russia constantly decreased, and the people are getting more dissatisfied with this. So the inflation is high, imported goods doubled in price since 2014, and the Russians simply cannot afford the lifestyle which they had during the pandemic, during the times when the oil price was high and when the economy was in a perfect shape. But let us take a more detailed look than the small figures here. Well, 2020 was for the whole world an exceptional year. Well, not only for Russia. Now, officially, the economical crisis of 2020 is finished, and the economy is on the level of 2019. Interesting is also what happened during 2020. As here you can see at the beginning of the crisis, the different industry sectors, how they behaved. So building and home improvements, for example, dropped firstly and recovering quite soon, as all the Russians started to build or rebuild their flats, their houses, their dachas, as they had actually a lot of time for this. Prices for land and buildings rose dramatically over the last year too. Travel agencies had the best bounce back then and started open up in early 2021. So while many other countries still have closed borders, we could fly from Russia to Dubai, Maldives, Tanzania, and so the tourism even within Russia was growing dramatically. So as of today, the passenger volume is 4% only lower than in 2019, while the tourism within Russia is 30% above the level of 2019. So this is quite a huge increase considering what has happened last year. Well, first, also the consumption of alcoholic beverages increased, but it was not a stable increase, which is good for the health, certainly for the people. Also, computer and software had just a short boom when the people already equipped the home office. There was no further developments. Here we can see a little bit how the ruble developed since the early Crimea crisis in 2014. Well, this is now the euro to the US dollar will come a little bit later, but it's quite interesting to see the development from the past. So end of 2016, the economic crisis at this point of time, which actually started with the sanctions in 2014, again with Crimea, was officially recovered. Since then, Russia had a strong development in areas to be independent from foreign companies and states. This resulted, for example, in the increase of the monetary reserves, the import substitution policy of the government, and also the need for some industries to localize, for example, with a local production, to participate, for example, in state tenders. When I came to Russia 13 years ago, the ruble rate to the euro was about 35. So at this point of time, it was possible for 1,000 euros to rent a one-room flat quite far away from the city center. Nowadays, the rate is about 85. With the same 1,000 euro, you can rent a room for with 2 or 3 rooms, quite much closer to the city center. So this is quite a good indicator how much the ruble has lost in value. Since this time, it's also more difficult for the Russians to travel abroad, as the prices for imported products increased significantly. For example, cars. Well, funny on the other side, as we mentioned already, tourism, that the places in business class in planes is quite often booked, which is kind of a signal that there is some money in the economy, but not maybe with the right people. From the Russian side, also the bans on the food products from Europe also drove to a price increase of a lot of products. For example, Swiss cheese, well, doubled or tripled in price, but the quality of the Russian production, unfortunately, is not yet on the Swiss level. So today we still stand at a rate of about 85 over the whole year, actually, 2021. So here we are quite stable, as also the oil price increased over the last year. How the FX rate now to the US dollar might develop, so also for the future, is a good question. now, especially because it's a budgeting season also for all the CFOs and the commercial guys. So it's quite interesting how this might develop. So this is a chart what we have received from Western Union Business Solution and how they expect the ruble rate to develop until 2023. So the the ruble stabilized against the US dollar to a rate of about 73, which is also now, and 85 to the euro. So in 2022, the ruble should average also about 27 to 72 to 75, and the euro to 86 to 87. So this looks quite stable for the near future. Let's hope only that there are not new surprises which would change this. Even considering the high inflation rate, and this is one thing to watch is also over the next months about the forthcoming interest rate increases on both on the US side, but also on the Russian side, because the increase in the interest rates in the US will tend to make the ruble a little bit weaker, while the interest rate increase on the Russian side would make the ruble stronger. So also the oil price is in the last time less and less impacting the rate of the central bank, is simply ironing out this volatility. But the interest rates, which is another topic, like the Russian central bank is doing now a decent job of managing the risks to growth and inflation by tweaking up these rates moderately. So the consumer inflation hit 6.5% in July, and the bank raised the key interest rate to 6.5 to avoid negative real interest rates. And so now in September, actually last week, the reference rate was put up slightly to 6.75, as also the inflation in August was now 6.7%. So this is most probably also kind of the ceiling for both for the inflation and the interest rates, because it's expected that the inflation will go down on a long-term basis to about 4%, which is also the plan from the central bank. Maybe also shortly to the GDP. The GDP fell in 2020 by 3.1% and is back about plus 4%. Today there was new information about 4.2%, also for 2021. And the year 2022 should also be quite stabilized with roughly about 3%. Currently in September, most part of the economy are working quite fine, and exports in the industry benefits from the global turnaround. How the GDP might look like in the upcoming years, you can see here, this was also sent us by DT Global Business Consulting, another partner company who did a quite good outview in the next few years. So already, as I also mentioned, the consumer price inflation should come down to closer to 4%, while the FX reserves still continue to grow, as they did also over the last years. It's also that the Russian central bank is increasing the reserves and able to be more stable in case of a next potential crisis. If you need any information into this statistics, what we have seen, let me know later on. This will be quite happy to provide you with. About the ease of doing business index, well, there's often a different perception of it. I just put it here because it's quite interesting to see what happened over the years, because we're comparing here Russia 2010 and 2021. We even did not put all the different sectors because it would be too much. But it's good to see that the overall rating improved from 120 to 28, which is quite a significant improvement. And we also should consider that 190 economies are rated in this ranking, so place 28 isn't so bad. Well, 23 in Canada is even much better, but nevertheless, so this is a way to go in the future. The Russian president also wanted to improve until the top 20, but it seems that this will not very possible in the near future. Maybe the areas where Canada is good or Russia is improving, well, starting a business seems to be quite easy in Canada. Well, good, maybe for us that it's not in Russia so easy because this is part of our usual job. Trading across borders, yes, if you're considering sanctions and how difficult is everything with the certification and so, then it's clear that here the ranking with 99 isn't quite good. So trading across borders estimates the time necessary for the businesses to recover from the handling process at the border. Then paying taxes seems to be easy in Canada. while enforcing contracts isn't that easy, obviously. With enforcing contract, this means that how much time and costs are involved in order to resolve a commercial dispute with a local first instance court. Getting credit, yeah, Canada quite good, top 15. Registering property is quite easy in Russia, I have to say. So it's easy to buy a land or whatsoever and register in a property. It's even now possible with the Russian Sberbank, for example. They do an accreditive and directly make the registration with the register. So actually to see in the last 10 years, a lot have moved in a positive direction, but still there is some way to go. When we see what is happening, some areas which were affected by COVID is, well, the business recovery, as this is the time which is necessary then for the businesses to recover. By beginning of September, half of the companies, about 44%, told that they already fully recovered and are better now than before the COVID crisis. And so the rest is still on their way to do so. The microchip shortage also didn't stop in Russia. So analysts forecast a reduction of the vehicle production due to the shortage of microchips, what strongly puts also some pressure on the availability of cars and certainly on the prices. So even used cars and new cars are extremely expensive for the moment. Also, the number of banks in the last year were decreasing during the pandemic, also already before, but even much more faster than in the pandemic. So, for example, in August, there were available about 28,000 branches of about 400 banks, which are 1,500 branches or 5% less than it was a year ago. So while the prices for real estates increased dramatically, the prices for apartments and other like flats and so on rose about 20 to 25% within a year, which also leads to quite risky credits and loans, because about half of the people finance the new apartments with a secured loan and an equity of only 10 to 20%. On the other hand, the Ministry of Finance told that the budget surplus is now already, I think with the end of July, it was the data of 900 billion rubles. So this means that the government expenditures are quite on target, but the income from the income from the government is about 70% over the budget, which is, well, somehow interesting that it is so, but quite good. So it's also very likely that the government does not plan further lockdowns. We have seen it in the crisis that with June 2020, all the lockdowns have been lifted. So we were free to go to restaurants, more or less, I would say, with some QR codes and so on. So it was quite an interesting strategy Russia did. So the companies were not closed for a long time. So it's also not likely that it will be done in the future, and manufacturing always stayed open during these times. Just a quick view maybe on the bilateral trade. What is quite interesting, that both countries have somehow their export products, which is quite far above the average. So what we see on the left is what Canada imports, and on the right we see what the exports from Canada to Russia. So the data is from 2019. Maybe this is even better than the 2020 data, because they are not, well, maybe reflecting the real situation, which should be. So Russia's export is certainly leading fuels, following by chemicals. I think for the most countries, this will be the same who have business with Russia. On the other hand, machines and electrical equipment are the main export goods to Russia. So it will be quite the same for any other country other than Canada. If you have then later maybe specific question on this, we can also discuss it, but it will take too much time to get into much detail, but maybe just quite some main export goods. For example, the top goods Canada exports to Russia, which are surprisingly uranium and other radioactive elements, also pet food, turbojets, turbo propellers, gas turbines, machinery. So these are the most export goods from Canada to Russia. And on the other side, oil and oil products, minerals, is that what Russia is exporting mainly to Canada. When we see how the development was over the past So it's also quite visible that we have a quite diverse picture. On the one hand, Canada's imports from Russia were growing over the years until, well, 2020 is hopefully a different year. So it will be extremely interesting to see what's happening in 21 and further, if they are still rising or not. On the other hand, the exports from Canada to Russia were decreasing after the crisis in 2014, which we already have seen at the very beginning. So the exports are quite on a low level, and it would be interesting to understand why this is the case, if it's due to the sanctions, due to the business opportunities, to the price the Russian customers are willing to pay, and how this will be developing in the future, because it could also mean that there are a lot of opportunities from the past simply not followed up anymore. Yeah, I just mentioned briefly sanctions. Sanctions related to Russia were imposed under the Special Economic Measures Act in order to respond to the gravity of Russia's violation over the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Everything, well, it was in March 2014. So I believe those who did business at this point of time will never forget this time. Well, the typical time of the sanctions are the asset freeze, the export and import restrictions, and financial prohibitions. Well, we do not have too much time to go into details, but actually it's well, more or less forbidden for any person in Canada and Canadians outside of Canada to deal in any property, enter into any agreement, and provide any support or financial support to somebody who is in the list of these designated persons. So in case you do any business with Russia, it's extremely important to follow the sanctions and to check your counterparty before you do business or before you sign an agreement, in order to well, be sure that everything is correct and fully legally. So this would be basically a quite brief introduction about the state of the economy. When you have questions in the chat, we can answer them well after the presentations, that we see how much time we have left. When a company then decides to enter the market, well, the market is quite large and interesting, this I have to say. It's quite difficult to find the real choice to understand what is the right option to do. So how to start a business in the world's largest economy is often the question which we get to answer during our usual work. And what is very positive, what I see in the last years, is that the companies are taking more and more time to think about if it's worth to go. Because before, I would say before 2014, the companies often thought, oh, my competitors on the market or my neighbors on the market ever have heard that something is good happening on the market, and they build up their business, and then they understood maybe the strategy was not correct, or there was no exit strategy. So this is now different, and I think this is a very positive development, because it also decreases the failures and the risk of failures and the loss of capital in this regard. So it's important to have from the beginning on a clear understanding which strategy and targets a company has. So including an exit scenario, because, well, anything can happen. And if you know already the cost of a market exit, then it's really easy to budget everything. So often the first step is a market analysis to understand the potentials, possibly engage a market representative on the market and search for partners who have already, well, to have already something in the hand before to start the operations, and you understand which costs are waiting for you. The market analysis, for example, can help you to estimate the volume. This means that you check the imports, maybe, for example, on HS codes from the customs database, and add the local production minus exports, that you also understand what is the value on the market. It is also possible to do a supply chain analysis, where you look on the origin of products, their import and the local distribution schemes, and also the sales channel. Well, on the other hand, a customer analysis can give you more information about who is your potential customers, which prices are paid on the market, maybe what your competition is doing, that you have a clear understanding at the beginning, what is the aim on the market. So you maybe be also aware that when exporting the goods to Russia, you need to have the local certification of the products, which is also quite developing in the last years. So also here you should first take care to understand what is the cost and the time in connection with the certifications before you agree with the customer about the price or some delivery terms. So it's very good to have a good understanding before you enter the market. Here we will not go through much to all of the issues here about the sanctions. We shortly already spoke. Well, yeah, I think in general it's quite good covering everything. If you come to the market, there are different entry strategies. I mean, with the direct sales, which is the quite easiest form to enter a market, it's actually to work on an ex-works basis. Russian customers certainly don't like this, but if you have a unique product, okay, why not? So in this case, the foreign legal entity sells the good directly from abroad, and the customs, well, to the customer in Russia, and the foreign company is not subject to any Russian taxes or any local registration or anything. But it will be difficult to certify the products because this can only be done from a Russian legal entity. It means that you have to convince or agree with your customer or a distributor or any other partner to make the certification. Also, the time and the costs involved should be taken into account here. Outstaffing and representation, this is kind of a light entry, means that you are hiring on an hourly basis or partly or full-time a person who is present on the market, but without having the need of the company registered in the country. So there's no legal presence in the country, just a person, well, running on the market, trying to find new clients for you or whatever aim you have. On the other hand, well, if the market appears not being attractive, it is a quite safe and easy strategy to exit the market because there are no costs involved except of the cost of this person, well, his labor agreement actually to be terminated and the costs connected with this. So this is quite an easy option to just to test the market to understand is the market fine for me or not. The next steps would be, for example, to register a rep office or a branch, which are actually quite similar but also different. According to the Russian Civil Code, both branches and rep offices are subdivisions of the foreign legal entity that are located at a place other than the legal entity's head office. Means that the head office usually is abroad, so the legal entity themselves has only the division in the country, means branch and rep offices are not the legal entity by themselves. The difference between a branch and a representative office lies in the nature of the activities which they're entitled to perform. So, for example, the rep office is here to represent the interest of the foreign legal entity, and this limits its activities to non-commercial nature, such as marketing, gathering information, market research, and, well, the first contact maybe to potential customers. A branch, in contrast, is able to perform other parts of the commercial legal, well, of the commercial areas of the foreign legal entity. So it's not limited to the representation. So it means, for example, if there's some installation works, if there's well, some other services to be done, this can be done via the branch. What is a restriction, certainly, is that the branch cannot import products for sale. It can import equipment for its own use, but it's also then a little bit limited. To have a very, let's call it unlimited variant, this would be the LLC or another legal entity, like maybe in, well, other forms are existing, but the LLC is quite the most common form. I think more than 90% of the foreign companies registered are LLC. It's also, well, it's a Russian legal entity, so it's a fully Russian company with the liabilities being limited to the interest in the share capital, so which is actually being paid in from the owners. The minimum share capital is 10,000 rubles, which is about $130, so it's, well, not so much, I would say. The process for the incorporation is quite easy and takes only 5 working days. Usually the preparation for the documents, which have to be done outside of Russia, means the documents have to be legalized with an apostille and so on, takes much more time than the incorporation process than itself. Yeah, well, it can import without any restrictions, but also, for example, the deregistration process is a little bit more difficult than the incorporation process itself. Here we will not go into detail, but I just want to show you what is necessary to understand in case you want to set up any of the entities in Russia, being it a branch, a LLC, or representative offices, because for all of them you basically need all the areas here to be considered. So, and partly before you already register a company, for example. So it means that any company needs to have a business address. This must be known before the incorporation, because you will have this information in the incorporation documents. You will also need to organize a bank account, both for the for the general director, for the company itself, which is taking quite some efforts, because it's easier to open a company than actually organize the bank account, because the banks have quite often high standards of information which they require from you. Well, all the other issues I think are quite clear. I mean, in case if you want to work in Russia, you will need to have a visa, a work permit, and all, well, this needs just to be done and organized before you're really starting, because, for example, the work permit for the general director, being it a foreign person, cannot be obtained by the company which is actually not yet registered. So it's not possible to assign as a general director a foreign person. A lot of areas here, but I think today it will not work out with the time to go into detail of everything, but we will be happy to speak with you maybe after the presentations or during the chats, questions, in case you have anything in particular you want to know about this. So I believe for the first introduction, if there's not too much questions, we move to Christoph and his areas. So I think the questions we will do later on.
So thank you very much, Christopher, and warm welcome also from my side. My name is Christoph Spank, and I'm responsible for market research in Schneider Group. Without further ado, let's dive into the topic. I'm going to speak about clean tech and potential ways of how Canadian companies can enter this industry in Russia, in particular sectors. We're going to talk about wastewater, we're going to talk about waste management, and we're going to talk about carbon emissions and potentially also the energy sector at a later point of time. So in order to make up time, I'll try to run through it real quickly. Russian wastewater. In general, some statistics to start with. So there are about 182 million cubic meters of polluted wastewater in Russia that are being let into surface waters on an annual basis, of which only 22 million cubic meters or 12% actually have undergone or actually have not undergone any purification, and only insufficiently purified 88%, and only 2% of those 182 million cubic meters have been cleaned in a sufficient way. However, on the other,
that's a total of 102%.
That is correct, actually. We'll need to recalculate those percentages then. Actually, thank you very much, Nathan, for that comment. But in any case, what I'd like to draw your attention to is the table on the right-hand side, because if you look at the pollutants in the wastewater, it becomes apparent that in international comparison, Russia actually is not so bad when it comes to the quality of wastewater. And this is, let's say, a challenge that I'll try to get to on the next slide. How is it possible that actually on the one hand, the wastewater itself quality-wise is not so bad, but at the same time, the water that is being released actually does not qualify for international standards. As you can see on that slide here, only 5% of the wastewater that reaches the wastewater treatment facilities is actually of the required standards. 20% of the facilities that cannot actually remove the nutrients that are necessary to be removed to the standard that actually is required by the Russian law. And 75% of the wastewater that is discharged into the water bodies does actually not meet these requirements at all. Why is that? The reason is that in Russia, unfortunately, the technology that is being implemented, that is being used, is of the nature one size fits all, meaning that it does not take into account local peculiarities, in particular to industries that are present in the particular areas in the country, whether it be agriculture with the influence of nitrogen, for instance, that is being released into the ground, or whether it is in industries or production plants that are being that use a lot of water and contaminate that water. Water treatment facilities are of the same nature in both areas, and unfortunately thereby cannot cope with the different specifics of the water that reaches these facilities. At the same time, a lot of water treatment plants are actually originating from the 1990s and earlier, from the Soviet period, and consequently are in dire need of update and modernization. The operation facilities, or the operation of the facilities, is actually also not done or very often not done according to the standards that they require. It starts with the staff that is operating those facilities, and it ends basically with maintenance and modernization of them. And this is where we also see great potential for improvement and for Canadian companies to bring in technologies that actually are catering towards the specific needs of specific areas, rather than a one-size-fits-all solution that is unfortunately currently in place in the Russian Federation. Of course, the government is aware of this problem. There is a so-called national project, which is called Ecology, and part of that, and we'll get to this in a second as well, and when we talk about emissions and clean air, is also the cleaning of water bodies and so on and so forth. Hence, the goal, of course, is to improve the ecological status of wastewater bodies, and in general, of course, to reach the standards that are actually set by the law. By doing so, what is required is, of course, a capacity increase according to the growing needs, because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of facilities date back to the 1980s, 1990s, and have not either grown or shrunk to the size that is actually required in the particular areas. Automation is a big topic that is big in many areas of the industry, actually, but in particular, of course, also in the clean tech area. And the sewage sludge that is actually being produced, or that is left over, basically, is also something that needs to be taken into consideration, because currently it's not being treated in the correct way. On the right-hand side, I'll just show you briefly two examples of CAPEX projects that are currently being put in place. The one on the top is actually in the Urals area. This is the area that is heavily, for those of you that are familiar with Russian geography, where in particular the steel industry is quite predominant. Hence, the usage of water and the pollution of water in this particular area is also quite vast, and henceforth also the requirements for treating that water in the correct way. And an example from St. Petersburg, where, as you might know, St. Petersburg, located at the Baltic Sea, a particular neighborhood or area of the city actually has received a new sewage system, or is going to receive a new sewage system, which is currently being implemented, and where also foreign companies were asked to participate and introduce their technologies. Now let's talk about, let's leave wastewater and move on to waste management, which as you see here on the right-hand side, sort of we try to show that, let's say, the waste and recycling cycle, life cycle that is actually, let's say, on an international standard, in order to show you a little bit of where Russia would be on that particular cycle. So waste management and recycling and so on are quite new topics, I would say, in Russia. In Moscow in particular, where we are basically based, only in 2020, actually during the time of the pandemic, the recycling that many of you are familiar with having different bins or garbage disposal units being located outside apartment buildings have been introduced. And as a next step, or consequentially also, the city purchased 85,000 new garbage trucks, because obviously, one of the flaws at first was that while citizens were asked to separate garbage in two different bins, they would bring one and the same garbage truck and empty both bins into the same garbage truck, which obviously defeats the purpose. Hence, the city then eventually managed to buy 85,000 new waste containers and 500 new garbage trucks, and also build 4 new waste processing complexes that are being implemented and that actually sort the waste in order to use part of the waste for a further processing and so reintegration into the cycle. At the same time, the Russian president signed a decree in order to close 190 landfills throughout the country. Landfills, unfortunately, are still the predominant form of waste disposal in the country. Russia, obviously being a very large country, has plenty of potential for such landfills, but it is obviously understood that that is not the correct form of the reduce, reuse, recycle theme, and henceforth it has been decided to build a number, I think 25 waste incineration plants actually throughout the country, most often in the vicinity or outside of major metropolitan areas, in order to generate electricity or generate energy actually from the waste instead of burying them as has been done before. One, let's say, law that unfortunately has been discussed over many years and to somebody or to some people's great relief and to others great resignation has just been postponed actually from being introduced on the January 1st, 2022, now being pushed until January 1st, 2024, is the so-called producer responsibility law, which actually shifted the responsibility in particular for packaging, which obviously is one of the main drivers of pollution in the country, or I guess on a global scale, to the producers rather than the consumers. And basically it obliged manufacturers of products to take back their packaging materials and actually direct them into, collect them, sort them, and direct them towards organized disposal, in order to reduce basically the amount that is eventually funneled into landfills and to reuse a lot of the materials. And in addition, producers were urged to, or are going to be obliged to pay an environmental fee, depending, of course, on the amount of packaging and so on and so forth. And this had, of course, quite a, let's say, or has, of course, a potential impact, in particular for foreign producers or producers of goods that are not located in Russia but sold in Russia, because it is obviously much more difficult for them to collect the materials. And they would in particular need to find local partners here that they can partner up with. And this is also something that we can eventually help and assist with. So speaking, sort of moving on to the next topic, carbon emissions. As many of you might be aware of, actually, the European Commission has actually introduced what is called a Green Deal. I think back in 2019, this major policy was declared, and part of this new Green Deal is the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is, of course, relevant to Russia, but it is also relevant to Canadian firms, since it is targeting towards anybody who is exporting to the European Union. And this is why the headline says, and corporate pledges to reduce emission. Basically, what it means is it is targeting companies who export to the EU, and these will be obliged to purchase emission certificates. So it's a kind of an indirect tax. And these emission certificates are based on the emissions that are being, emitted during the production process. Hence, and I'll get to this in a second, companies or industries that are, let's say, particularly unenvironmentally friendly have a major disadvantage when it comes to exporting to the EU. At the same time, we know that in the last 2-3 years, the ESG movement has taken hold of a lot of sectors, and hence a lot of corporations have actually made pledges to reduce their emissions to net zero, and furthermore actually obliged their international subsidiaries to to reduce to net zero as well. One example that I've just recently spoken with is the general director of PepsiCo, for instance, here in Russia, which along with the corporate pledge that was made in the US, actually now has to reduce its emission to net zero, I believe until the 2040. And now, of course, also needs to think about how to reduce his emissions similar to those companies who export to Europe. Whereas, for instance, GD or PepsiCo does not produce in Russia and exports to Europe. So hence both actually exporting companies and companies that are on site locally need to reduce their emissions. And how will this be done? So a few more words about the carbon border adjustment mechanism from the EU, just to give you a quick timeline when this will take effect. So initiated, it was in 2019. In July this year, we've actually seen the first document about, let's say, the industries that are being targeted. When this is going to start in 2023 at first, there will be 5 industries, in particular cement, electricity, fertilizers, and well, some other metallurgy related industries. However, of course, it is planned that at some point later in the future, probably towards 2025, 26, more industries actually will become part of this scheme, or will become part of or subject to this carbon emissions trading scheme. So it is worth keeping this in mind. And like I said, it's actually not only relevant to companies in Russia, but anybody who exports to the EU. Now let's take a look at, let's say, how the impact that this carbon border adjustment mechanism will have on Russia. Currently, Russia, well, actually, this is the numbers pre-COVID-19 and from 2019. The export value of Russian goods is about $233 billion US dollars from Russia towards the European Union. So it's quite tremendous. And you can see the sectors actually that are being targeted there: metallurgy, the mineral fuels, oil and gas, and so on and so forth. Of course, as some of the industries that are particularly environmentally unfriendly. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide as well, those industries that would be most affected. Some of them will be subject already to this mechanism starting from 2023, some of them in the second stage at a later point of time. It is estimated that the annual impact of this carbon border adjustment mechanism on the Russian economy is going to be about $50 billion US dollars annually. So unfortunately, not quite or actually quite a large impact financially. Where are the opportunities for Western and, of course, in particular, Canadian companies when it comes to this particular subject of carbon emissions? Since the Russian economy is very heavily dependent on, as Christoph has also already mentioned, exporting of, let's say, raw materials that are being used in the refinery industries abroad. The notion of, let's say, green production has unfortunately not been implemented here until very recently. It is now that we see that the Russian government becomes active, and I'll get to this on the next slide, with pilot projects and so on and so forth, in order to kind of trim businesses in order to become more environmental friendly. To reduce their emissions in order to sustain their competitiveness in comparison to other countries that can, whose industries can produce with lower emissions, and hence competitiveness will shift on a global scale once this measure has been introduced in 2023. But the required technologies that are actually, let's say, required in order to reduce these emissions throughout or in various industries are unfortunately not present in the Russian market at all, since there has been no need for them until this or basically just now. So companies are, of course, on the one hand, now in the position that at first they need to measure their emissions, which is of course the basis for everything, and then in the second stage need to think of where they can locate the most rewarding and the most beneficial reductions in emissions and of course the most cost efficient ones. So on the right hand side, you actually see some of these companies that are targeted, obviously, since they are also the largest players in these industries. And that are, of course, to some extent, I have to say, and I'll explain to this in a second, the largest clients for such technologies. I say to some extent also because obviously some of these companies, Gazprom is for instance on them, are subject to sanctions. So it's always a bit, let's say, challenging to see how one can deal with these. Nevertheless, if technologies are not available in the country, there is also a possibility to get them into the markets. So how did Russia react to the introduction of this? Let's leave aside, let's say, the political side of it, because I guess you can imagine how these reactions would have looked like. In order to trim, as I mentioned earlier, the businesses and the industries here in Russia to become more sustainable and to become and to produce greener, the government actually has introduced a number of programs. One of them, for instance, and this has by coincidence already been initiated even before the carbon border adjustment mechanism became public, is the so-called program of clean air, in which Russia had identified the most polluted 12 cities, or the 12 most polluted cities in the country when it comes to air quality. These are mostly so-called mono industry towns, where there are big production plants of various types with large emissions actually that make a big impact on the air quality in the city. And the government has actually stated the goal to reduce these harmful emissions by 20%. And this is tracked on an annual basis. So this project is currently still going on. There are some, well, the latest data is obviously from 2020. So there were some cities, some of these 12 cities where the reduction actually has taken place. And there were other cities where this is actually not the case, unfortunately, despite even the COVID situation with reduced production. So we'll have to see how this is going to play out. The ESG principles are now also on the business side, are finding implementation more and more throughout banks, for instance. So there are some banks who are no longer giving loans to projects if they cannot actually show ESG principles in their business plans. So this is also taking shape now. And I think one of the major programs that the government has actually introduced is a sandbox project, or a pilot project in the geographical area of Schagerl, which is in the Far East, actually closest to Canada, basically opposite of Alaska, and in which there is now an emission trading scheme actually being implemented in this particular region, and businesses are encouraged and financially encouraged and supplemented for the implementation of technology in order to produce cleaner and the lessons that are going to be learned during this 4 years period are then supposed to be scaled on a global scale to Russia, or actually on a national scale. So this is something where companies actually have, or in particular international companies, actually have a great potential to dive into the opportunities that the market currently presents, because businesses are in dire need for these technologies simply because they are not available in the Russian market yet. Now, a few words about the Russian energy sector. As you know, and as you've seen before on the previous slide, the major industry players when it comes to gas production, oil production, and electricity generation, you're probably familiar with names such as Gazprom or Rosneft or Lukoil. Many of them actually are being state corporations. Lukoil is an exception here in this case, and most of them are actually Russian held corporations or Russian owned corporations. There are two notable exceptions, which is particular in the electricity generation sector, which is sort of on a national scale, Enel Russia. Enel being the Italian, or sort of a subsidiary of the Italian electricity producer, and Unipro, which is a subsidiary of a German electricity producer, and they are both taking a major role here in the Russian market as well. So these are companies that are present here, that are subsidiaries of foreign entities being present in vital industries here in the Russian market as well. So all of this is possible. The facts that, and I will not go through them simply due to time reasons, that you see here on the left-hand side of the slide, the summary of which is basically Russia is a major producer of energy in the world. However, it is also a major consumer of energy in the world. And if you put that into perspective, actually, based on, let's say, the amount of output, the amount of people, the amount of GDP generated in the country versus the amount of energy consumed in relation, it actually consumes more energy than it actually should based on the output that it generates, meaning the effectiveness or the efficiency of the of energy that is being produced here, or that is being that finds its application in the country, is actually quite low. And leaves room for improvement. And this is also where we see a great potential for international firms to participate in order to reduce the emissions and to make the Russian economy more sustainable in the long run, and to keep its competitiveness on an international scale. Now, a few words about, let's say, the latest trend, and where another area where we see great potential for international firms is actually the area of hydrogen. Russia, and I think many countries are actually now looking towards, when they look towards emission reduction, they look towards hydrogen as a way of storing energy in a sufficient way, and thereby sort of making electric cars and so on and so forth closer to reality. What is currently going on in the country is that hydrogen production is very limited. I would say it's even at a sort of research state still. But the plans, of course, that the government has are, let's say, quite elaborate, simply because they understand that in particular, the export markets for oil and gas in the EU, where most of the pipelines are actually going to, are going to eventually become obsolete if the energy that is being exported cannot be adjusted towards, let's say, the trends of the European consumers. And so there are currently projects going on where the idea is eventually to, beside transporting oil and gas through the pipelines towards Western Europe, to mix or to substitute, for instance, with hydrogen that can then be actually producing electricity at the places where these pipelines end. So this is something that the government is currently urging local businesses to look into. And there are a number of international corporations that are currently taking place, in particular between state companies like Gazprom or Rosneft, but also and Western businesses looking into the generation of hydrogen, the transport of hydrogen, and also the transmission of hydrogen. So yeah, this was the last slide. How we as Schneider Group can actually help you to grab or take hold of these opportunities is, for instance, through dedicated market researchers. We identify these opportunities for you. We help you find the designated partners in the market that would be required. For instance, we help with certification and import issues, in particular of new technology, because it needs to be certified. And we also assist in any legal matters that might arise. So with this, thank you very much for your attention, and I turn over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Christoph and Christopher. I have questions from the chat for each of you. Let's start with the one to you, Christoph. Is there any data regarding the nominal amount of capital and operational expenditures in the whole waste management sector?
There is actually, but I don't have it here. I can certainly supply that after this meeting.
Similar question, data regarding the generation and utilization of waste in Russia by material category in thousands of tons. I realize that's a very narrow question.
Actually, it is. I would have to look this up. I don't, not here right now on my desk, let's say.
Okay. And to either of you, can you provide greater insight into the approval process for adopting new and innovative clean tech into the Russian market, and how much importance is placed on ISO 14034, the environmental technology verification, as part of the regulatory approval process?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the question was a bit fast, honestly. So in general, of course, new technology that is going to be implemented in the market requires certification. Any technology that is not yet there, whether it's a simple machine or a technology, needs to undergo certification procedure. This is usually, honestly, it's a quite elaborate process, which is a bit difficult to explain here within 20 seconds. So I'll be happy to reach out to whoever asked that question. Actually, we at Schneider Group, we have a dedicated import and certification department that can answer all the questions, how that works.
Okay. Question to you, Christopher, from Nathan. Nathan says, I heard from you and many other forecasters that Russian inflation will soon decrease to 4%. Why do you believe that? In fact, he argues the cost of all industrial inputs and labor are high and projected to increase. What do you think will bring inflation under control?
So, well, actually, it's a tricky question because it starts with different angles. On the one hand, which inflation we have? A large extent is certainly imported inflation, because a lot of equipment, tools, and whatsoever is imported to Russia is simply imported with higher prices. So the production facilities and the sellers have to give these prices also to the customers who are actually paying for this, or actually are paying. We see that the ruble rate went down a bit. So it's, well, about 5% down over the last few months. So this should also give make the inflation a little bit less. What the government could do? Well, there are a lot of different possibilities. In the case of in the fiscal policy, the government could increase taxes or cut spending. So in fact, to decrease the purchasing power of the people. We do not see this, or we would not expect this actually. From the monetary from the monetary policy point of view, could be also the possibility to increase also the interest rates. This is actually what was happened and done in the last months when the inflation rate went up. The government increased the interest rates, but there's also a limit to this, because higher interest rates will also mean that the cost of borrowing will be higher, means that the investments will be reduced, which is then has a negative effect on the economic growth. So you would have then to balance out the economic growth with the interest rates. It also would mean higher mortgages for the people, which is reduced consumption. It also increased return on savings, so the people would use less money to buy products and so on. So we'll also have less pressure on the prices, which should go down. I think what we see now is a mix basically of two. Is on the one hand that with the interest rates, the interest rates were putting up steadily, which should bring out a little bit the power from the inflation. And as the exchange rate, the ruble gets stronger, this is reducing the inflation also. Well,
if I may add one thing, that the Russian government actually also takes, let's say, anti-marketing or anti-market or anti-market measures in order to keep inflation in check. So one thing is they go after price increases that they believe are not justified. So they give you an example. Sunflower oil actually has been put under price control, and there was a 6-month period when producers were not allowed to sell any oil in the market above a certain price. And there are actually a number of categories that that are in particular of concern to consumers, in which the government very closely looks at the consumer prices, because businesses obviously say our input prices rise, so hence we need to put forward that price increase on consumers, and the government is very much interested in keeping these price increases to a minimum. At the same time, just last point, exports are also being limited in order to bring, for instance, more, this is something that we saw last year, to bring more wheat, for instance, leave more wheat in the Russian market, to keep the price of wheat products at some stable level. Only a certain amount of wheat was allowed to be exported. These are only two measures, for instance.
Yes, and maybe just an extent to it was maybe well, one of the latest stages, like from price controls, it could be also control of wages to reduce the spending of the people, but this would certainly will not have a good political effect, I would say.
Thank you both for staying on. I'll risk stretching this out by putting one more question. It's actually a two-part question. One participant wants to know if there's a way to access a directory or links to Canadian companies active in business in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And related to that, a question is about companies active in investing in the nuclear energy sector.
I think for the first question, the first way could be or should be maybe to CERBA, because I believe CERBA knows a lot of the companies being active in these countries. Well, other ways would be certainly also to check the commercial register for specific companies, to check the import basis or simply the homepage of the interested companies. So there are different ways to reach these companies or to find out these companies are, but then it would be already good to understand the industry, maybe the type of the company, to understand which method would be good to search for. Well, maybe colleagues from CERBA, you have an overview about how many companies or which companies are active on the market?
The second part was about nuclear energy involvement investment by international companies.
About nuclear, I have no idea at all, I would say. Christoph, you have any clue?
About nuclear, I think this is actually quite a challenging industry because it's considered a strategic industry. So I think foreign participation is very, very restricted. It is, depending, of course, on which technologies or products we're talking about, should be possible to find out via, for instance, an import database that we also have access to. So we could certainly check that. I cannot guarantee that there would be something turning up because I mentioned these restrictions in this area, but we would have to check it.
Folks, thanks for staying on generously for 10 extra minutes, and thank you for attending this program. Thanks very much to Christoph and Christopher, Nathan for your kind words, and Alex for organizing us. Wish everyone a good day.